conferences by demonstrating her exceptional expertise in her field. Ma'am is also a dedicated educator, having successfully conducted numerous faculty development programs across various disciplines. Currently, she is guiding 4 PhD scholars in their research endeavors. We are honored to have Dr. Najma ma'am with us today and look forward to her valuable contribution. Welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Without wasting any time, I'd like to begin the session because there is so much to talk about. I've already shared my PPT. Just let me know whether the PPT is visible or not so that I can arrange accordingly. Can anyone?
Visible,
ma'am. Visible? Okay. Thank you. Right. Today's session, I have been given Renaissance to the Enlightenment period. Okay, and let us begin. All right. So basically, an overview of the session, as I always do, that what I'm going to discuss in the whole session. As you can see, we have a long list to go. We have an overview of Renaissance criticism, an overview of Enlightenment criticism, major themes in Renaissance criticism, major themes in Enlightenment criticism, Renaissance to neoclassicism, and we have a comparison between Renaissance and Enlightenment criticism, modern implementation of historical criticism, and some references for your study. So let's begin the introduction of the session. Is my voice echoing? Or is it audible clearly?
No, ma'am, it's absolutely fine.
All right. Okay. Thank you. All right. So before we delve into the discussion of Renaissance criticism and Enlightenment criticism, the only thing that I wanted to talk over here is that let us see what literary criticism is. I know from past 3 days, everyone is talking about it, so you are very much aware of it, but I'll quickly go through it. What is it actually? It is about the understanding of culture, social, and intellectual context that influence text. So it teaches us how to question, interpret, and appreciate literature on a deeper level. So through criticism, what we can do is that we don't just read stories or poem, we engage with philosophical ideas, historical perspective, and human experience that transcends time and place. So that is the beauty of literature. And that is how we learn criticism. So from the Renaissance onwards, criticism evolves as writers and thinkers begin to challenge established tradition. They challenge the established tradition and they create something new in the form of art and expression. So Renaissance rediscovers classical ideas and it focuses on humanism. And it also talks about the classical learning. So critics of that particular time looked up to ancient Greek and Roman texts. Why? Because these were the texts which were used to write criticism or write text in English. The Enlightened period, if we talk about, it focused more on reason, progress, and empirical thinking, right? And the enlightened critic began to question authority, embrace rational thought, and argue that literature could serve as a tool for social and political change. They believed in individual interpretation and saw the reader as an active participation in meaning making. So this is basic difference between the two, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment criticism. So what is the objective of our discussion today? So we are going to examine how criticism evolves from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment period. We are going to explore key critical key critics and their contribution, and we will try to draw connection between the historical criticism and modern critical practice. So when we talk about examining the evolution of literary criticism, we'll first take a look at Renaissance, a period of intellectual revival and classical imitation. It explores how critics during this time believed that literature should reflect the classical tradition of harmony, order, and ethical purpose. Whereas if we go to Enlightenment, it was about reason and progress that were at the center of discussion. So critics began to value rationality and individual interpretation. Critics began to value rationality and individual interpretation and looked at literature with that. So that it is not just an art form, but it becomes a social tool that could promote moral and political reform. So this is how the role of criticism has changed. So we are going to look at that. We are going to examine how it evolved from harmony, order, and classical tradition to rationality, individual interpretation, and social tool. This we are going to see, and we will try to explore the key critics and their contribution. I have only talked about a few because there is a long list and we cannot discuss all over here. I'll just give you a basic idea so that when you go back and you start reading about them, you can talk about the other critics also. So we are going to talk about Sir Philip Sidney. We are going to talk about Alexander Pope. All right. So the key critics were the in various periods from Sydney to Pope. We are going to talk about them. We are also going to find out the connection between historical criticism and modern practice. So let's begin with the discussion. So the first thing that we are going to do is that we are going to look at Renaissance literary criticism. So we all know Renaissance, it means rebirth. I'll quickly go through it. It was a cultural movement right from 14th to 17th century, originated in Italy and later spread across Europe. We all know this. It marked a renewed interest in art, philosophy, and literature of ancient Greek and Rome. The revival of classical knowledge, which was fueled with humanism, that brought about significant development in many fields, including literature and criticism. So this is basically Renaissance. So during this period, Europe experienced a shift from the medieval scholastic approach, which was heavily influenced by church, and its focus was theological interpretation of text, to a more human-centric approach. So basically it was theoretical, theological, and now it is human-centric. So Renaissance thinkers sought to understand human potential, emphasizing reason, individualism, and the capacity for intellectual achievement. So we have to understand this. So this is the concept. The key concept of Renaissance are, we all know humanism. We have talked about it. We have discussed about it. We have also given examples about it in our classroom. How humanism, how imitation of the ancient, and how decorum works. I'll quickly go through it. But my focus here is not history, but criticism. That is the only twist over here. So when we talk about humanism, humanism was the intellectual movement that placed emphasis on human potential, reason, and the study of classical antiquity. So humanists believed that studying ancient Greek and Rome text could offer valuable insight in human nature, morality, and society. They advocated for the development of individual character and intellectual capability. So basically, humanism was more focused on human nature, morality, and society. The impact of this criticism was that Renaissance literary critics view literature as a medium to explore human emotion, virtue, and flaw. They were trying to explore human emotion, virtue, and flaw. They believed that literature, and especially poetry, could serve as a means to cultivate moral and intellectual value, right? So if most of the example here would be talking about poetry and its dominant in context of Aristotle's poetics, all right? So the impact of Renaissance criticism can be seen in Dante's Divine Comedy, can be seen in Sir Philip Sidney. So when we take the example of Dante's Divine Comedy, which was written early in 14th century, that gave the beginning, or it paved the way for Renaissance humanism. It portrayed human soul's journey towards redemption, combining classical elements with Christian theology. So this is where it began, and it slowly gained its momentum in the Renaissance period. Later, when Sir Philip Sidney wrote his defense of poesy, he argued that poetry is uniquely equipped to instruct and evaluate the human spirit. Right? So it can instruct and evaluate the human spirit because it can present idealized models of human behavior. Because poetry has the capability to present idealized models of human behavior, blending delight and instruction. So this is the defense of Sidney in his A Defense of Poesy for Poetry, which became a major part of criticism. Right? We are still talking about humanism. Imitation of the ancients. So Renaissance critic believed that best literature was created by imitating the work of classics, especially the Greek and the Romans. For example, Homer, Virgil, Aristotle, Horace, all right? But imitation, however, was not merely copying. There was a difference. For them, imitation was not to copy. It was, sorry, to internalize classical form and adapt them creatively to contemporary context. So they followed the classical form and created the context of the current time. So that is where creativity was used. So what was the impact of this kind of writing? That literature was seen as reflecting universal truth that were already expressed in the classic. The idea was that classical writers had achieved an understanding of the world that modern writers should strive to emulate. So what it says is that classical writers had already achieved the awareness and understanding of the modern world, and they could help us to comprehend the modern world in a more better way. We can take example of Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen to understand this concept. It is a classic example of imitation of classical epics like Virgil's Aeneid. Spenser combines classic and medieval tradition. He combines two things, and he uses allegory over here to present moral lessons while maintaining the grandeur and formality of classical epic poetry. So this is the beauty of writing, where you utilize the classical structure and then you implement it in your current scenario. So it helps you to develop your literature and it looks more creative and original. Sir Philip Sidney argues that by imitating classical model, poetry could reveal deeper philosophical truth that prose or historical writing could not, because we know that Sidney has already defended poetry. So here he defends poetry and he says that poetry is more strong in any form of literary work. It can help or it can interpret better than any philosophical, it can interpret any philosophical truth better than prose and history. He believes that by presenting idealized characters and actions, poet could help reader recognize universal moral truth. All right. We'll be discussing about this moral truth later. Okay. Then we come to, so that is imitation of ancient. Then we come to decorum. The concept of decorum refers to the appropriate behavior, style, and form in literary work. So this is the highlight of decorum, that it wants you to have an appropriate behavior, style, and form in literary work. So during Renaissance, critics believed that literature should follow certain established rules of forms and structures to achieve aesthetic harmony. Now, this idea came from classical rhetorics, where different genres require different style, tone, and level of diction. Right? So, this is the impact of such kind of uh, criticism was that literature, according to Renaissance critic, needed to adhere to the genre-specific conventions or genre-specific conventions. Tragedy requires elevated language and noble characters, because that is how the Greek tragedy was written. While comedy should focus on ordinary people and be written in a more colloquial style. So the genre and the class was already divided. That tragedy should be focusing on the upper class, comedy could be about the common man. Right? We can take example of Ben Jonson over here, where Ben Jonson, in his Every Man in His Humor, we all have known this text. So I'm not discussing about what actually the storyline is, but how it is helpful over here. So Every Man in His Humor by Ben Jonson adheres closely to the classical principle of decorum, with its clear distinction between high and low character, and a strict adherence to the unity of time, place, and action, reflecting a deep respect for Aristotelian rule. So when you look at Ben Jonson's Every Man in His Humor, it talks about the three unities, which again was given by the Greek writers: unity of time, place, and action. We are going to discuss it uh, in the upcoming discussion. So I am leaving here. I have discussed Sir Philip Sidney. I am not going to discuss Catalovisco. You can go and refer to his work. He translated and communicated on Aristotle's Poetics, stressing that literature should follow the strict rules. So we are talking about one critic. He is an Italian writer, who's probably Italian or French, but he focuses on the contribution of the writers. All right. So he's an Italian writer. All right. So he translated the Aristotle's Poetic, and his work reinforces the perspective of nature of literary rules, emphasizing strict adherence to classical unity. So he was someone who was more focused on the unity of time, place, and action in drama, and he believed that this rigid dramatic structure uh, would definitely help in a better writing, right? So that was his concern, and he has taken example of Shakespeare here, that in plays like Romeo and Juliet and Othello, he has not followed this unity of time, place, and action, but still he could create the charm and beauty of the text. So this is what he has tried to say. So Renaissance literary criticism marked a period of revival in classical learning and human-centric thoughts. It emphasized on moral instructions, imitation of the ancient, and formal rules, such as decorum. The work of critics like Sidney, Castavesco shaped the literary landscape, creating a foundation for later period for criticism. Right? So it helped in or influenced the neoclassicism and the Enlightenment period. Their idea about the ethical purpose of literature and the need for formal structure continue to influence modern critical thought. Even as contemporary critics' challenges can be seen or viewed in this particular perspective. So that is an overview of Renaissance and Greek critics. Because I am in a little bit hurry because there is so much to talk about. The second concept is about major themes in Renaissance criticism. So the first Renaissance critic believed that imitation of classical models was essential to produce great literature. Originality was not a prize as adheres to classical form. Right? So that is imitation versus originality. So how do they differ in Renaissance criticism? So during the Renaissance, Imitation of classical models from Greek and Rome was considered as the foundation of great literature. They believed in that. But Renaissance critics believed that ancient writers such as Homer, Virgil, Aristotle, Horace have already achieved perfection in literary form, and modern writers should seek to emulate their achievement rather than create entirely new form. So this was the concept of Renaissance critics, right? Originality, as we understand today, was not a high valued. Instead, it was not highly valued by the writers. All right. Why? Because adherence to the principle established by classical authors was seen as the key to produce excellent work. So, if you want to produce an excellent work, this is what we can see in neoclassicism also. If you study history or if you teach history of English literature, you will know that neoclassical age has, you can say that it revived. That is the reason it is called neoclassicism, that it has brought back the classical structure in writing, right? So, here originality was not valued, but we can say imitation was valued, but we have to remember imitation here was not blindly following something. It was to understand the structure and then utilize it in the current scenario. That is the important key concept over here about imitation and originality. So if we look at imitation as a creative mastery, Renaissance thinkers' imitation did not imply mindless copying. This is what I'm trying to say, that it did not imply mindless copying. It engaged with the classical past, adapted it, refined it, and then fit it into the present context. So that is the beauty of imitation in the period of Renaissance. All right. So no blind following, but adapting, refining it, and then utilizing it in the present context. They viewed this process as an intellectual and artistic dialogue with the past. So we have to understand this fact. The concept of imitation involved understanding and incorporating the universal truth and formal perfection achieved by ancient writers while expressing them in ways relevant to contemporary society. So when we do this, or this kind of practice take place, then definitely we will have new kind of writing, but the structure should be followed. That was the concern about Renaissance thinkers. So when they are talking about imitation, they don't want you to copy it as it is, but they want you to adapt it, refine it, and fit it into your present context. Remember this. We can take example of Edmund Spenser again over here in the Fairy Queen. He has imitated the, you can say, old classic of Virgil's Aeneid, and where he utilizes it's a Christian allegory and medieval romantic tradition. He has tried to mix it, and he has blended the classical ideas of heroism with Christian virtues of the time, reflecting Renaissance practice of imitation. This is the beauty, which can also be applied in our contemporary days, right? So that's how the writer's creativity works, and this is how it should be. So when we see that Sydney is defending imitation, because we are talking about imitation versus originality. So Sydney is defending imitation in his defense of poesy. He argues that poets imitate not specific historical reality, but universal truth. So the focus is on not historical reality, but the universal truth. So for Sydney, poetry was superior to history because it transcended the imperfections of real world, offering idealized models of virtue and action. His defense was rooted in the belief that by imitating classical works, poets could reveal deeper philosophical truth. Sidney explains that while philosophers provide abstract truth and historians present actual facts, poet combines both. What does philosopher provide? They provide abstract truth. Historians present actual fact. But what does a poet do? poet combines both the creative representation of what ought to be and providing moral guidance through their work. So, this is how he defends poetry. We can take imitation in tragedy and comedy also, where we can see that because Aristotle's Poetics talk about the unity of time, place, and action, this is one of the important aspect. We can take example of Shakespeare's famous deviated work from the classical rule was Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, right? Where he shows that imitation of classical history and its narrative can provide enduring work of drama. So you can imitate the classical history, but at the same time, you can be a little bit innovative in your presentation. So that is imitation versus originality. So when you are talking about imitation versus originality in Renaissance, imitation was given more important than originality. You have, please keep that in mind. Then we come to moral and ethical dilemma. So Renaissance critic believe that literature had a dual purpose, right? Literature had two purposes basically during the Renaissance time. It has to teach and it has to provide pleasure or delight, the word used at that time. Okay. So the moral dimension of literature was central to Renaissance criticism, where critics sees literary work as tools. They used to see the literary works as tools for instructing the audience on virtues. So basically, any literary work should have some moral value to it. So at the end of the literary work, the audience can get some virtue out of it, ethical behavior out of it, and at the same time they could see the consequences of moral failure on stage. So that is the moral and ethical dimension included in criticism. So this concept is important. So literature is moral instruction. So the role of literature was also of moral instruction. So what did Renaissance critic do? So according to Renaissance critics, literature was not merely for entertainment, but it was a medium through which human beings could learn about virtues, morality, and ethical dilemma. We have all heard this word a number of times: virtue, morality, and ethical dilemma. The belief in the didactic role of literature meant that authors were expected to write with the intention to improve the moral characters of their readers. They had to write not only for the sake of entertainment, not only for giving pleasure to the reader, but their focus was to give some moral lesson to the reader. Like our stories of Panchatantra, when you read them at the end, you have a moral lesson and you learn something out of it. So, value giving. Poetry in particular was seen as a vehicle for shaping individuals and society through the promotion of virtue. So, poetry was given more emphasis during this particular time. And again, I have example of Spenser, the Fairy Queen. It's an explicit example which aims to teach moral lesson. Why? Because the allegorical nature of the poem presents characters such as the Red Cross Knight, which is embedded with Christian virtues like holiness and faith. If you look at that character, you are fully charged with your religious view and faith in religion. All right. So through these adventures of these characters, readers are meant to learn lessons about importance. What is actually importance in life? Righteousness, temperance, and chastity. So that one character will show you this three morals. All right. So this is what you should be inculcating once you read the whole canto. So what Spencer's work demonstrates is Renaissance literature was used to guide the audience towards moral reflection and personal development. So basically, the aim was moral reflection and personal development. Um, Sydney's perspective on the ethical role of poet is also important. The use of tragedy as a moral lesson. So we can see that poetry could give you moral lesson, tragedy could give you moral lesson. All right. The example in tragedy could be Macbeth. All right. It serves as a moral exploration of ambition and moral corruption. So the play reflects Renaissance belief that literature should not only entertain, but it should provoke ethical reflection. So Macbeth's downfall illustrates that how moral weakness lead to personal and social ruin. All right. So this is one example. Then that is moral and ethical dimension. Now you come to the role of the critic. So during the Renaissance, critics were seen as gatekeepers of culture and literary values. So this is one thing, that the role of the critic was that they were gatekeepers of cultural and literary values. Their role was to ensure that literature adheres to classical ideas and contributed to the moral and intellectual improvement of society. So this was the aim of Renaissance critics. So critics were not simply evaluation, or critics were not simply evaluators of taste in work. They were moral authors whose task was to maintain the integrity of artistic experience in line with the ethics and cultural tradition. So how much responsibility is given to the critic, that what they have to do? They were moral authors. Their task was to maintain the integrity of artistic experience within the line of ethical and cultural tradition. So critics were considered as guardians of classical ideas. If we look at this definition of Renaissance critic, so we can say that they were considered as the guardians of the classical idea. How? So they were drawing the classical authors like Aristotle, Horace, and believed that literature had specific rules and forms. There were specific rules and forms that had to be respected. So here it had to be followed is not the concept, but it has to be respected. And the critic's job was to evaluate whether a literary work adheres to these rules and to guide both writer and reader. So it's not only about the writer. They were not looking at the writer also, but they were also looking and guiding at the reader also in understanding how literature should function within society. So their role became more important. So if we can say that their role was to become the guardians of classical ideas, their role was also, the role of the critic was also as a moral guide. So Renaissance critic also saw themselves as moral guides. They took the responsibility and they said that we are moral guides. Like nowadays, all the, you can say, journalists have taken the responsibility that yes, we will, show the world the reality. In the same way, the critic has they saw themselves as a moral guide, responsible for ensuring that literary contribution to the ethical development of society. So whatever literature is written, it is helping us in the ethical development of society. So now here the role of the critic was to assess whether a literary work upholds moral standards and conveys the appropriate lesson to the audience or not. Right? So that is now their responsibility, which emphasizes on morality in criticism. This morality in criticism was a continuation of the classical tradition where art was expected to reflect ethical ideas. So basically, critics accepted that it is their responsibility to be a moral guide and see that whatever art or literary work is published, it should be reflecting ethical ideas. So when we are talking about the role of critic, so the role of the critic, first role was that they were guardians of classical ideas. They saw that the classical rules and forms were respected. The second was they considered themselves as a moral guide, where they had to see whether the work is reflecting the ethical ideas. And they were also influenced by the classical critics, right? So Renaissance critics were often they often referred to the classical model of criticism, which was already given by Aristotle and Horace in their respective works, Poetics and Poetica. So to validate their own judgment, they also needed something which could, be an evidence that yes, on this basis we are judging. So they were influenced. This Renaissance criticism was influenced by classical critics, right? And many other critics. This was very nicely discussed by Atanu sir in his session, so I'm not talking about it here much. How the critics are influenced or the age is influenced one by the other. So when we talk about major themes in Renaissance, so it talks about imitation versus originality. It talks about moral and ethical dimensions, and it also talks about the role of critic, which reflects a deep engagement with classical ideas. So basically, Renaissance critics believed that great literature could be created by imitating the classical past while adapting it to the present. All right. So you imitate the classics and adapt it in the present. And they saw literature as a moral force in society, with critics playing a crucial role in ensuring that literary works adhere to the high standards of form and context. So this tradition laid the foundation for the development of literary criticism in the upcoming centuries. Like you can see this influence in neoclassicism, you can see this influence in Enlightenment period also. Okay, so these are the major themes which we have to remember when we are talking about Renaissance criticism. Now, when we go from Renaissance to neoclassicism, or because during Renaissance and neoclassicism we have transition period, so either you can call it transition to Renaissance, sorry, transition to neoclassicism, or Renaissance to neoclassicism. So in 17th century, the transition from Renaissance to neoclassicism took place. There was a literary movement characterized more by structure and disciplined approach to literature and art, while the Renaissance was marked by a revival of classical ideas, which was blended with Christian values and humanism. But neoclassicism respected a more rigid adherence to classical form, with a strong emphasis on order, reason, decorum, and the principle of harmony and balance. So when you are talking about neoclassicism, you have to remember this word: order, reason, decorum, harmony, and balance. So neoclassicism reflected the broader intellectual and cultural shift of the age of Renaissance. Enlightenment is the age of reason, sorry. Okay. So it valued rationality and empirical thinking. So these were two things that were important. In Renaissance, it was imitation and originality. When you come to neoclassicism, it is about rationality and imperial thinking. This idea permitted not only philosophy and science, but also literature and art. So what happens in literature is that critics tried to establish rules and guidelines that could evaluate, or you can say evaluate, not evaluate, but elevate writers to its high form. Emphasizing here, they wanted to emphasize on simplicity, clarity, and restraint. So these are the three things they were looking into, which the writer should keep in mind: simplicity, clarity, and restraint. Whereas Renaissance allowed for some flexibility in interpretation and creativity while repeating the classical model. Example of Shakespeare, all right, if you remember. But that is not done in neoclassicism. Neoclassicism demands a return to the order and formality of ancient Greek and Roman literature. So, particular focus was on dramatic unity, proprieties, and morality. So the shift was influenced by Aristotelian principles, revived and reframed by critics like John Dryden in England and Nicholas in France, right? So these were the two who talked about it. I'm going to talk about one and then I'm going to move. You can read about the other on your own because this time constraint, I have reached only to the third point. Okay, so when we come to Dryden, we all know who Dryden was. He belonged to the 17th century and he wrote an essay on dramatic poesy where he engaged in talking about the classical unity of time, place, and action, which was given by Aristotle in his Poetics. Right? So Dryden argues that drama should be judged by its ability to create an emotional and intellectual response, blending order and reason with variety and creativity. So this is what his concern is. While he respected the classical rules about structure and decorum, he believed that modern English drama, particularly the work of Shakespeare, could transcend these rules by offering a rich depiction of human nature. Here we can have example of Shakespeare and Ben Jonson both, because Shakespeare he was a genius and his creativity is seen in his work, but he did not adhere strictly to the classical unities. He changed number of time, he made changes in it. This reflects that Dryden believed that while the rules of classical dramas were important, they could be modified if the emotional impact of the work was enhanced. So concern of Dryden is that if you can create a more emotionally impactful work, then there should be some licensing, some freedom to the author to, change or play with the rules of classical drama. The same thing was said by Nicholas when he talks about, because he is a French critic, so I'm not focusing on French or any other critic because this is specifically for English literature, but these are very important writers and critics, so you should know about it. He also followed Horace Virgil, Homer, all right. He was someone who was prominently using decorum. The concept, the idea that characters should behave in ways appropriate to the social status, and that the style of the work should suit its genre. So that is why he stressed that tragedy, for instance, should involve noble characters speaking in elevated language, while comedy could involve more common characters and lighter dialogues. So again, he goes to decorum. He follows this concept. Right? So the key concept here, which are discussed, is unity of time, place, and action. I'll quickly go through this because we all know about this. So unity of time, place, and action is unity of time, place, and action talks about. All right, it dictates that a play should focus on a single action. Single action is unity of action, takes place in a single location, unity of place, and occurs over a span of not more than 24 hours, that is unity of time. All right. So these principles were considered essential for maintaining the coherence and credibility of dramatic work. So adherence to classical unity, when we come to neoclassical critics like Dryden and Nicholas, they supported the use of unities. Why? Because their main focus was creating focused coherence drama. They believed that plays followed these rules were more likely to maintain emotional and intellectual consistency. So we can say that when John Dryden talks about it in his essay of dramatic poesy, he talks about Shakespeare's achievement of great emotional power by sometimes breaking the unity. He also talks about varieties and emotional complexities. Sometimes it justifies the diversion from the strict classical form. All right. So he again, we can take example of Shakespeare's Macbeth and Hamlet. He often ignores the unity of time, place, and action. And we see that Dryden admires Shakespeare's ability to create emotionally rich and intellectually challenging works despite his divergent form classical conventions. So that is how they defend it, but at the same time, they also tells us that how particular author or writer has attained that by using the classical unity or by somehow changing the form of classical unity and then creating the work. So that is unity of time, place, and action. Then we have refinement of taste. So refinement of taste refers to the refinement of taste is something that talks about critics' role, not just as an interpreter of literature, but as a guide for public taste. So neoclassical critics believed that it was their responsibility to help and educate both writers and audience about the highest form of literature and the principle of good taste. So you can see that Renaissance critic also uh, considered it as their responsibility, and we see that neoclassical critics also consider it their responsibility that they are supposed to educate both writer and authors about the good taste. All right, so that is important. So here the critic is also a guide because they think that the critics are the custodians of literary culture, and their role was not merely to criticize individual work, but to help evaluate the quality of literary production. Uh, So we can take again example of John Dryden. Dryden has talked in his essay of poetry where he defends the role of the critic, and he says that he defends the role of the critic, and he says um, that critics should refine the taste of the writer. One who is responsible for guiding both writer and audience towards a greater appreciation of literary excellence. So he argued that good criticism involves not only an understanding of classical rules, so it's not necessary that if you know all the classical rules, then only you can write, but also an appreciation for the art of writing itself. So we have to appreciate the writer's art of writing, which includes elements like wit, emotion, and imagination. All right. So this is what Dryden says. The same has been talked by Nicholas when he talks about the literature. He talks about not only the taste, he talks about decorum, again unity of time, place, and action. So according to him, literature maintains its moral and intellectual integrity. His emphasis is more on simplicity, clarity, and balance in writing, which can be reflected in neoclassical writers. Okay, so when we talk about the transition or the transition to neoclassicism, what actually is happening is that this transition represents a shift from creative freedom and humanistic ideas of the Renaissance to a more structured, disciplined, and rational approach. So basically, we talk about creative freedom during Renaissance and humanistic ideas during Renaissance. But when we come to neoclassicism, it talks about more structured, discipline, and rational approach to literature and criticism. So key figures like Dryden and Nicholas emphasizes the importance of order, reason, and decorum in literary works. So these critics focus on order, reason, and decorum in literary work, and they advocate for adherence to classical unity. Okay, we are running out of time. I'll quickly go to the Enlightenment period. Okay, so Enlightenment period, known as Age of Reason, we all know 18th century. We all know it emphasizes Enlightenment, emphasizing emphasizes on rationalism, empiricism, individualism, and the belief in progress through the application of reason. So this is what the main concern of enlightenment is. So the enlightenment thinker believed that human beings, by using the rational faculty, could understand the universe, improve society, and promote human happiness. So this intellectual movement rejected superstition and dogma. They rejected it and challenging the traditional authorities in religion, politics, and science. So this is how it differs from Renaissance and neoclassicism. So when we talk about the Enlightenment, so in Enlightenment, they represented a shift from the moral, formal, rigid structure of neoclassicism to a more flexible and pragmatic approach to criticism. So you can see you can see the shift from the rigid structure of neoclassicism to flexible structure of or pragmatic approach in the Enlightenment period. So empirical thinking was valued, means critics approach text with an eye for realism, rationality, and moral utility. Okay, so now the focus was whether the text is talking about empirical thinking. This is what empirical thinking is, that they looked at the text with realism, rationality, and moral utility. Literature became a vehicle for questioning social norms. So that was one important thing that happened, that it started questioning the social norm. It also promoted rational thoughts. It also advocated political and social progress. Sorry. Satire, wit, and irony became prominent tools. So these were the tools used for what? For questioning the social norm, for promoting rational thoughts, and for advocating political and social progress. What was used? Satire, wit, and irony. They became the prominent tool to expose the flaws of society and to criticize aristocratic, privileged, religious authority and political tyrant. We can take example of Alexander Pope over here. He is one of the major critics also. We all know about Pope, one of the most influential literary figures of the Enlightened period, poet, satirist, and critic. Okay, he has too much to his credit. His work will widely range with, he has written about wit, moral insight, and technical mastery. His work are good. What he believed for a good criticism was, as much as art as writing itself. This is what his concept is, that good criticism was as much as art. It was as much as art as writing itself. So when you are criticizing a given text, your criticism is as much important as the text itself. Arguing that a successful critic must possess good taste, an understanding of nature, and a sense of decorum. So Pope is focusing on good taste, understanding of nature, and sense of decorum. Again, unity of time, place, and action. So for Pope, nature was the guiding principle in both writing and criticism. So for him, nature was very much important. So if you have good understanding of nature, you can technically, it will help you to guide both in writing and criticizing, as it is representing universal truth that were best understood through rational observation. So this is what he thinks about good criticism. He also gives importance to wit, a combination of intellectual sharpness and creative insight in both writings and criticism. So it is required, this is required, wit is required, WIT, shrewdness, wit is required, combination of intellectual sharpness and creative insight in both writing and criticism. Why? Because for Pope, wit was an essential quality in literature, as it could make moral and philosophical ideas more engaging and accessible to readers. So this is one thing that he talks about, its influence on later criticism. So his work, Pope's work, contributed to the development of formal criticism and the refinement of public taste in the 18th century. His classical ideas promoted the idea that literature should be relevant to its audience and reflect contemporary values, particularly in terms of moral clarity and aesthetic balance. So, this is what he has said. I will skip Samuel Johnson and Walter because we are running out of time. Okay, so Samuel Johnson advocated for the balance between classical adherence that appreciates of Shakespeare's creativity, whereas Voltaire, a French Enlightenment thinker who believed that literature should challenge authority and promote social progress. So these thinkers, Enlightenment critics, talked about this idea. The major theme of Enlightenment criticism. Just a minute. So the major themes in Enlightenment criticism is first reason and empiricism. Okay, that's the slide, right? I will rush. So here the key concept in Enlightenment is because it is an age of reason, it was grounded in the belief that rational thoughts and empirical observation could lead to an understanding of the world and improve society. The focus here was human experience and observability reality. So literature was expected to reflect logical reasoning, promote clarity, and continue to the quest for truth. Rationalism in literature, it was seen as a tool for intellectual and moral education, where Enlightenment critics and writers believed that literature should be rational and realistic, providing a logical explanation of the world and society. They rejected superstitious dogma and irrationality, preferring instead they addressed human issues through reason, debate, and empirical evidence. We can take example of Alexander Pope, an essay on criticism, where he talks about that the writer should be adhering to nature. It should emphasize on clarity, order, and balance. It should advocate the concise and clear expression of ideas in literature. The next is empirical approach to human nature. Empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes from experience and observation, influenced both philosopher and literary criticism during the Enlightenment. So, what writers were trying to find out is they were trying to represent real human experience and social reality, grounding their work in the observable world. So, they were portraying a complex individual shaped by their environment and personal choice, reflecting the empirical understanding of human nature. Again, we can take Samuel Johnson's example of Preface to Shakespeare, where he praises Shakespeare's ability to capture universal truth. He also reflects on the complexities and inconsistency of real people. It highlights, it also reflects Shakespeare's reflection on Enlightenment, on emphasis on imperialism and realism. So literature's value lies in its ability to depict the world truthfully. So that's what is important. Literature as a moral and social commentary. So Enlightenment critic believes that literature should not only provide enlightenment but also serve as a moral and social function. Okay, and this period saw an increasing emphasis on satire, political commentary, and individual liberty. So now a time comes when satire and social critique becomes important. Satire becomes a key genre during the Enlightenment period, because writers were trying to bring humor and irony to expose the hypocrisy, corruption, and irrationality in both the ruling classes and institutions such as church and monarchy. So this is what they were utilizing, and their aim, the satirical aim, was to provoke moral reflection. All right, that is another important thing. So moral reflection and individual liberty, okay, is also important. Why? Because this is what they were trying to highlight. Moral improvement of the society was the deepest concern of the Enlightenment literature. Individual liberty was becoming a central theme in Enlightenment literature, where writers challenge authoritarianism and oppressive social norms. You can take example of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels over here. They were promoting social progress. So Enlightenment writers were using their works to advocate social progress. They were trying to promote human rights. Literature became a platform for discussing equality, freedom. It also talked about the need for reform in systems of government, religion, and education. Okay, so the key role of the reader here was that critics began to recognize the active role of the reader in interpreting the text. So it is not only the writer who is important, but at the same time, the reader is also important. Rather than seeing meaning as solely embedded in the text itself, enlightened critics acknowledge that meaning is also shaped by the reader's experience and interpretation. So the role of the reader became important. The shift laid the foundation for our modern reader response theory. So this is where our reader response theory came into existence. So the reader's active role is important. Why? Because the critics argues that readers should approach text with a critical and rational mind, engaging with the idea presented in the work and draw their own conclusions. We can read Sartre, we can read Camus, we can read Kafka. Their works are definitely that their works definitely enhance the reader's active role in it, because you have to decide. The reader has to be an active participant. He or she has to use its reason and experience to derive the meaning. So this mirrors the broader Enlightenment belief in the importance. The belief is that it gives importance to individual thought and the capacity for critical reasoning. So that is one thing. And the democratization of reader is also important. So what the Enlightenment saw was the rise of printing technology and an increase in literacy. We all know during that period, printing press came into existence, and work was easily available, literary work was available, and which meant that more people had access to book and could engage with literature. So the period saw the growth of public education and the idea that literature should not be restricted to elite audience, but it should be accessible to anyone capable of rational thoughts. Okay, so that became more important. Reader empowerment became an important concept as critics began to recognize that the meaning of the text could change based on the reader's individual experience and social context. So the early reader response idea, the early reader response theory recognize the role of the reader. I'm not going into that. We will definitely go to there is only 2 slides remaining. I'm sorry, I'm exceeding the time. I'll take only 5 minutes more and I'll quickly cover up, because there is so much to talk about. So we will just quickly go to the comparison. What Renaissance criticism does it focuses on classical imitation and decorum. All right. It talks about literature as a reflection of universal truth. It talks about the role of critic over here is as a gatekeeper of culture and moral values. Right? And Enlightenment focus on reason, progress, and individual interpretation. Literature, it talks about literature as a tool for moral and social critique. It talks about critics as moral guides and champions of intellectual freedom. Both this period values moral instruction and believes that literature has a higher purpose. It also talks about critics' role, where the critic's role remains central to shape public taste and guide interpretation. So this is important. So, the shift from Renaissance to Enlightenment criticism reflects a broader transformation in European thought, from the reverence for classical antiquity and moral tradition to a focus on reason, progress, and intellectual freedom. However, when you read this, the two periods share a common belief, that is moral power of literature and the critic's responsibility to shape public understanding. So this is something when these two ages talk similarly: moral power of the literature and critics' responsibility to shape public understanding. While Renaissance critic focus on imitation and decorum, Enlightenment critic expands literature's role as a tool of social critic and moral progress. So here they emphasize the importance of individual interpretation and the promotion of rational thought more. Quickly going to the last slide. Modern implications of historical criticism. So, literary criticism as a continuum. Renaissance and Enlightenment criticism laid the groundwork for modern literary theory. So the concepts like formalism from neoclassicism and reader response theory from Enlightenment are still prevailing today. Application in research, number of application, we can understand the historical context of criticism, enhancing our ability to engage with contemporary theories. University professors and scholars can integrate this classical framework into teaching and research, exploring how early criticism influenced modern ideas like postmodernism, deconstruction, and cultural idea. So this is how the whole concept of criticism works. So the connection between historical criticism and modern literary theory highlights the continuity of critical practices and the way in which early ideas still resonate in contemporary criticism. So Renaissance focus on classical imitation and formal structure, which it evolves formalism, while the Enlightenment emphasizes on reason and individual interpretation. So it foreshadows the development of reader response theory and other modern approaches. So by understanding this historical foundation of criticism, scholars and educators like us can engage more deeply with modern literary theory, enriching both their research and teaching. So that is all from my side. Um yes, the house is open for questions. Sorry, I took 10 minutes extra, but there was so much. There are so many examples I couldn't share. But I hope I have given you a bird eye view of Renaissance and Enlightenment period. I hope I have done justice to the topic. Yes, it is. The house is open for questions.
Ma'am, you have made the thing so clear that I don't think that, at least I don't have question. And the way there is a silence, I feel nobody has that question.
All right. Silence has two meanings, but I'll take it positively. If there is no question, I will request the organizers. Can we call it a day?
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am,
I
and
hope
there is a question in the chat window, if you can see it. Somebody has just now posted.
Let me see, ma'am. I can't kind request an agenda and to organizer to share the PPT. Thank you. A deep insight is I can't see.
Ma'am,
I'll
I hope
yes,
there
please.
is no queries. I hope there is no queries from participant side, ma'am.
Okay.
We shall move to the end of session, ma'am.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. We are deeply gratitude to our Dr. Najma, ma'am, for your informative and engaging session. Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your vast knowledge and experience with us. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. And I'll definitely share my presentation with the organizers. They'll share it with you. No issues. All right. Thank you, everyone. And I hope you
Thank you so
enjoy
much,
your.
ma'am.
Thank
You're
you, ma'am.
Yeah,
welcome.
thank you.
Meet
Thank you
Thank
so much.
you, ma'am.
Good
Thank
night,
you, ma'am.
everyone. Good night.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.